Welcome to All Grown Up Now, a tale of retail, relocation, revenge, reinvention, reckless behavior, really good clothes, indiscretion, infidelity, domestic violence, and one kidnapping. I'm Kenneth D. King, podcasting from my studio near Union Square in New York City. This podcast is another in a series of installments from a novel I wrote called All Grown Up Now, A Friendship in 3 Acts, available on Amazon.com. It's the story of a small-town boy who dreams of being a grown-up and his journey to get there. Each week, you'll hear another installment of this story. I am pleased to announce that BearWorldMagazine.com will be one of the sponsors of all of the episodes going forward. We begin Act 3. In the last episode, which ended in the spring of 1990, Mark and Ken had a parting of the ways. This was the end of Act 2 in the novel, and Ken believed it was the end of a friendship. He didn't know it was just an intermission, although a long one. Episode 23, The Caper begins. The time, spring of 1995. The place, San Francisco. I got the call for help in late March of 1995, which would be 5 years later. The third phase of our friendship now began. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I came into the studio after the gym to pick up messages. On the machine, in a little old man voice, was Mark. "Hello, Ken, this is Mark," he croaked with this thin, reedy voice. "I'm leaving Victor and wanted to tell you, call me when you can." I looked at the machine, astonished. It took 5 years, and this was the only way he could say it. But I said to him all those years ago, don't call until you're ready to leave. And now he was calling. For a few minutes, I sat thinking about this, not wanting to call, but knowing I had to. Did I want to get hooked back into this crazy situation? Did Mark indeed want to leave? Or was this just a false alarm? Really, I did tell him not to call unless he was ready to leave, so I needed to assume that he was ready. So, what to do? I dialed his number, and Victor answered the phone. The minute I heard Vic's voice, I got this weird vision of an evil black vortex, accompanied by a wave of nausea. I hung up the phone, my heart pounding, and the hair on the back of my arms standing on end. What the hell was that, I thought. I was shaking all over. Never had I experienced something like this. It scared me. It was like looking into an abyss of pure evil. I know this sounds dramatic and very new agey woo-woo, but there you have it. It did scare me. It was very real. But I knew I had to call back. So I took a deep breath, dialed again, and made nice to Victor, who eventually handed the phone to Mark. "So where are you going?" I asked after the pleasantries had been dispensed with. "I don't know," he responded shakily. "What do you mean you don't know?" "The group said just to have a bag packed. It's something my family arranged. I don't know where they're taking me." Oh, great, I thought. My friend is being kidnapped by deprogrammers arranged for by his homophobic family. "Well, let me know where you are and how you're doing," I said as cheerily as I could. No doubt he couldn't know because Victor would just follow him there. I was away on business that next week. From time to time, I would think about the call and where Mark might be. Now, this was during the time when all of the drama surrounding O.J. Simpson was starting up, and it was on the news day after day. You couldn't ignore it. Hearing about it day after day triggered all of my angst surrounding domestic violence, and my thoughts ran to Mark frequently. Since that last phone call, I thought about him many times, wondering just how he was doing. There had been an article in Vanity Fair that I had read where the guy beat his child to death. The wife in this story was a former author who turned into a hollowed-out wreck from the abuse he heaped on her. She apparently was unable to stop him from beating his own daughter to death. And now there was the O.J. thing. My concern was that this would be the way it would end for Mark, that he would be found dead and Victor long gone. I would hear after the fact, in lurid headlines in the gay press, "Gay man found beaten to death, longtime companion missing." As it was, though, I wanted to know that Mark was indeed out of that situation and safe. Finally, I decided to write a letter to his brother in Boston. To refresh your memory, Mark had two brothers, one in Boston, David, a lawyer, the other in Florida, Robert. His father was also still alive. The judge, as Mark used to call him, had a stroke and was kind of incapacitated right now, so he couldn't know much of anything. I couldn't remember where in Florida Robert lived or which brother was the good cop and which one was the bad cop, so I sent a letter to Brother David, the lawyer in Boston, as his office was listed in the phone book. In the letter, I outlined where Mark and I met and the circumstances when we last talked. I finished up with an offer of any help I could. They only had to ask. Once it was sent off, I felt I couldn't do anything else but wait. Besides, I was going to Paris with one of my customers in a few days. In Paris, I learned a valuable lesson. I was traveling with a longtime customer and a couple of her friends. This longtime customer lived in Southern California, was married to a lawyer, and came to the Bay Area for sewing lessons with me and to see her boyfriend. The boyfriend was an Italian wrestler. Oh boy, was he hot. The trip to Paris was her treat to me. The short version of the story was that while I thought we were going to make up the visit as the days evolved, she thought that I was going to play lapdog and follow her around and watch her burn through money because she was paying for my trip. When things didn't go as she wanted them to, as I had other ideas about the visit, such as going to museums and stuff like that, she caused a heap of trouble, which ended with a very public confrontation in front of the Louvre, where I essentially told her to fuck off and find her own way back to the hotel and the airport, as she didn't speak a word of French. That ended a particularly lucrative revenue stream. As for the end of that particular story, the last I heard a few years ago, her husband got fired from his job, which meant the money dried up. She divorced him and didn't get a good settlement, no money, because he was unemployed. Strategically, that was a stupid move on her part. The Italian boyfriend dumped her because she had no more money. She ended up broke, fat, in Fresno, working as a clerk at the courthouse, and too big to fit into all of those clothes she made while she was working with me. That's what they call karma. Pity. But back to the story. Upon my return from that rather grueling trip to Paris, I found a call on my machine from Mark's brother Robert, the one in Florida. It turned out he was the good cop. He asked me to call him back as soon as possible as it was urgent. He left a number, so I called. "I'm glad you called back," he began. "David got your letter and sent it along to me. He asked me what this shit was all about and let me know he didn't want to get involved in Mark's drama." "How is Mark?" I asked. "Where is he?" "Ken, he's still there. He didn't have the courage to meet the man from the group. Victor has him so scared. He tells me that Victor has guns and has threatened him if he tries to leave, so he's still there." Robert then outlined the attempts he had made to try to find some sort of safe haven where Mark could go, to no avail. He couldn't find any resources in Los Angeles that could help Mark. There were homeless shelters, there were women's shelters, there were shelters for recovering substance abusers, but nowhere for someone in Mark's situation to go. When he called the Los Angeles Gay Community Center, the people there didn't want to hear about it. The gay community was under siege with AIDS, and even talking about gay domestic violence, well, it was the community's dirty little secret. The straights hated us enough, so shut the fuck about the gay domestic violence. And that's why Robert called me. I was the last resort. "So what do we do now?" I asked. Well, I asked him if he was well enough to go out for lunch with someone. Could he handle that? And he said he could, Robert ventured tentatively. I had a thought. Okay, Robert, I'll call you back in a few minutes. My next call was to Mark. Hey, Mark, it's Ken, I said as casually as I could. Hey, I'm going to be in L.A. tomorrow on business, and I wanted to see if you'd like to do lunch. Okay. I could hear confusion in his voice. Great, I'll pick you up at noon. Your place? I said brightly. Are you still on Olive Street? Yes, Mark said confused. Okay, then I'll see you later. Bye. And I hung up. The next call was to my travel agent, Dalinka, ordering a round trip and a one-way ticket. And a car. A Chrysler LeBaron convertible, I told her. I figured that if I got my brains blown out, my last ride would have been a hell of a lot of fun in a spiffy car, and I wouldn't have to pay for it. I'd be dead. Then I called directory assistance for the number to the Ivy and rang up to make a lunch reservation, just in case Vic was listening in. All that done, I called back Robert. Done, I said. I'm going down tomorrow morning. He thinks it's just lunch, and I didn't say any more, just in case the phones are still tapped. Now, what do you want out of this? Robert said, suddenly suspicious. You're not family, so... Oh, so you think Mark will go from the frying pan into the fire, I responded. Well, I don't know you, so... And I can understand your suspicion, I said. You're probably thinking that I'm going to want something out of this. Well, yeah. Well, sir, not every gay person is like Victor. Mark and I are friends, and he got me my first job in San Francisco. I made a promise to Mark many years ago that when he decided to leave Victor, I would do all I could to help. I made a promise. It's what I have to do now. Oh, Robert said. Besides, it sounds to me like you have no alternative, I said. Now, what can we do to repay you, he asked. Okay, don't get ahead of yourself. I only have limited means, and when Mark gets here, he's not going to have anything. I'm willing to do what I can to help, but I'm going to need help from you as well. So save the repayment thing to help Mark because he's going to need it. I'll call you tomorrow once he's here. After I rang off, the full impact of what was about to happen hit me. Watching Mom and Don and that whole train wreck as my previous experience, I knew that this wasn't a situation where I'd snatch Mark away, and then God would be in her heaven, and all would be right with the world. This was going to be a long process, and I needed some help, but fast. In San Francisco, there is an organization called Community United Against Violence, or CUAV. It's an extremely worthy organization dedicated to addressing violence against and within the gay community. I'd read about them in the gay press, so I called and got a guy named Greg on the phone. Briefly, I outlined the situation. This is something big, he said. You're going to need information about what to expect, and when your friend gets here, he's going to need our services as well. Come by in an hour, and I'll have a packet of information ready. Okay, thanks, I said. You need to read this tonight, he continued. Know what you're getting into. Know that it will eat up a big portion of your life for at least 18 months. Greg went on to talk about the dirty little secret in the gay community. There were some who, especially when it concerned two men, didn't want to believe it could happen. These people generally dismissed it as an S&M relationship because they couldn't believe that this sort of thing would happen between men. I mean, men could fight back, couldn't they? It was thought that this couldn't happen between two women either. Strangely, in some people's minds, domestic violence, like conception, needed a man and a woman to make happen. Since the gay community in the mid-90s was still reeling from the scourge of AIDS and all of the anti-gay sentiment it aroused in certain right-wing people, the idea of openly discussing domestic violence was too much for the community to contemplate. If anyone acknowledged it, let alone talked about it, well, that would give the haters just one more piece of ammunition to use against us. In other words, we weren't supposed to air our dirty laundry, as my grandma would say. To complicate matters, this shame usually keeps the victim silent. This silence means that the victim usually won't report the violence. No reporting, no paper trail, and then later the abuser could deny anything ever happened and there would be no record to contradict him. He could claim to be the one abused and paint the abused as crazy or just making it all up, which feeds the shame and silence about the abuse, another cycle. That was the mindset that Mark would be up against when he came here. Happily, though, Kuav was there to provide Mark and me with whatever help necessary to deal with this, and trust me, over time, they did. Another complication that comes up with gay domestic violence is the issue of where the abused person goes for shelter. This is what Robert found. When you have a straight couple, the woman, who is generally but not always the abused partner, can go to a women's shelter. Men aren't allowed there, so it's easier to keep the abuser at bay. For gay men especially, there are no such shelters, or there weren't in San Francisco at the time, and this is what Robert discovered when we started trying to get Mark out. And this is precisely why I had to go down to L.A. and snatch Mark away. When I finished with Kuav, I went downtown to buy pajamas and sundries for Mark. Since I was basically kidnapping him, I figured he would have just the clothes on his back. He needed something to sleep in, brush his teeth with, and shave with. He could wear my clothes during the day until we could get him some, as I assumed we were roughly the same size. Later that evening, I read the packet of information about domestic violence, and it all sounded really familiar to me. When I was dealing with Mom and Don's chaos as a kid, I didn't know that there was a profile for an abuser and a predictable cycle of violence. The only thing I observed when I was young was that it usually happened late on a Thursday evening after he drank a bottle of scotch. There seemed to be a pattern, but I didn't know that that was typical. In the textbook situation of domestic violence, the abuser isolates the abused, systematically getting rid of the abused person's friends, family, and anyone and anything they hold dear. In Mom's case, we moved to Oklahoma. In Mark's case, they moved all over the country. After the isolation, a cycle begins. First a honeymoon period, then a building up of attention, then the violence and abuse that releases the tension, followed by a period of remorse and promises to do better. This then starts another honeymoon period and another cycle. Since the abused is isolated, it's easy to become lost in this cycle. If you don't have anyone to check reality with, you lose your moorings. Over time, the cycles get shorter and shorter. Just because both partners are of the same sex doesn't mean that it works differently. People are people. As I said, it all sounded like a replay of Mom and Don. I finished reading and went to bed feeling a little creeped out. This all felt like I was going back in time, back to the days when we first moved to Oklahoma City, back to dances with landmines. Before I went to bed, I bleached my hair and made sure I set out my very cutest underwear and a stylish black outfit, so it looked like I was going to a fashion-y business meeting. I also set out my new Alain Michelin sunglasses, bought during that disastrous trip to Paris. I slept fitfully that night, knowing that I was turning my life upside down for someone who I hadn't talked to in years, and who would, no doubt, be a very changed person from the man I met back in 1980. Eventually, I just got up because I wasn't doing myself any good tossing and turning. I got showered and dressed, walked my sweet, pampered, little buff-colored, rhinestone-collared princess of a Cocker Spaniel, Daisy. I went out for an early breakfast, then took Daisy to the studio where she would wait for me to come back. While I was getting Daisy settled with the new doggy bone and filling her water dish, I listened to my messages. There were quite a few. They were all from Mark, and all said essentially the same thing. "Ken, this is Mark," I heard him say urgently. "Come get me now. Robert told me what you two are up to. Vic's not here right now. Come get me now before he gets home." Panic! The clock said 7:10 a.m. Now, over the years, Norma from my church and I used to talk about metaphysics. One of the topics she would hold forth on was the elasticity of time. She used to talk about how time sometimes moves very slowly, like when I worked for Crazy Carmel at Macy's all those years ago, but there are other times when it passes in a flash. We've all experienced both of these. She also said that time can expand to allow activities that would otherwise take way longer to complete. Something I never really understood until that morning. At 7:10, I grabbed my keys and the map to L.A. and ran out to the car. I took off for the airport. I was able to get to the airport, park, get through security, and onto the plane by 7:30 a.m. For those of you who have been to the Bay Area, you will know what a feat that was. Later, when I told Norma about what I had done, she just gave me the look that said, "Well, see?" At the Burbank Airport, I got the very spiffy black Chrysler LeBaron convertible and headed to Mark's place. Driving there, I went over my checklist again in my head. Clean underwear in case a trip in the ambulance was necessary? Check. Hair freshly bleached with only minor scalp burn? Check. My new Alan Meekley sunglasses for the convertible? Check. Julie Brown on the stereo singing Girl Fight Tonight? Check. I imagined how cool I looked to help distract me from thinking about the possibility of getting my brains blown out. As I turned the corner from Sunset onto Olive, I could see Mark sitting by the curb on a suitcase. I was shocked at his appearance. He looked like a little old man, hunched over, emaciated to the point of being skeletal. I could see the outlines of the bones in his skull through the skin on his face, which itself had gone as gray as his hair. I must confess that I was relieved to see him there. That meant I didn't have to go into their apartment and confront Vic and possibly get my brains blown out. Now, just for contrast, imagine me blasting down the street in a cool convertible with the top down, great sunglasses, the stereo playing really loud, and my white blonde hair sparkling in the LA sun, looking fabulous. I do love an entrance. Screeching up to a stop, I jumped out of the car, gave Mark a hug, threw his bag in the trunk, him in the front seat, and off we sped to the airport. During the plane flight back to San Francisco, Mark told me of the harrowing exit he had just made. It seems Victor had come home from another night of carousing to find Mark with a suitcase packed and went ballistic. Mark told Vic that he was just going to visit me for a weekend, that he had to get away for a little while. The whole time Victor had his gun out of the holster, fondling it and pointing it at Mark. Ken, I just had to get him calmed down just so I could get out of there. If he thought I was surely leaving him for good, he would have killed me. He said many times that if I left him, he would kill me, and after he killed me, he would go into my grave to get me. He trembled the whole time on that flight back. In the next episode, we will hear about what Ken was up to during that 5 years when he and Mark did not communicate. Thanks for listening. I'd like to thank BearWorldMagazine.com for sponsoring this podcast. You can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Spotify, and Google Play. If you have questions, you can reach me through the website, allgrownupnow.com. You can follow me on Instagram at Kenneth D. King, on Facebook at Kenneth D. King Design, or on my main website, KennethDKing.com.